All right. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar on everything you need to know about mental health in the workplace. We will be going through lots of the key issues, frequently asked questions, key things we think you need to know about mental health in the workplace. Now, as everyone probably experiences, I know we've got lots of people involved in HR, business owners, etc. with us here today, and you'll know that mental health in the workplace and beyond is becoming a huge touchstone issue. It's something that affects most of our daily lives in some measure or another, and obviously that's going to impact on the workplace. Now, the aim of today's webinar is therefore to enable us to consider how employers should manage mental health issues in the workplace, however they're caused, whatever the cause is, whether that's work-related or more often than not something outside of work as well, but it still impacts on the workplace. Now, employees, colleagues suffering from mental health, work-related stress, personal problems, triggering other triggering events, they need to be treated very carefully and considerately by employers in order to safeguard those employees' well-being at work. Clearly, as employers and working in HR as well, we realise the reality is we also need to balance those needs against commercial concerns of the business and also the welfare of other employees when we're determining appropriate action and decisions and how we go about looking after our colleagues who are facing mental health challenges. So today we're going to cover various topics, including how we manage sickness absences that are related to mental health, how we respond when mental health conditions may amount to disabilities, including the duty to make reasonable adjustments. Now, on that point, we're not necessarily going to dive too much into the definition of disabilities and disability discrimination. We've done webinars on that, and no doubt we will in the future, but we're just going to look how that can intersect with mental health challenges in the workplace. We're going to look at the impact of mental health conditions on other workplace issues. Often they go hand in hand with things like disciplinaries, grievances, performance concerns. So we'll look at the interaction there. We'll also have a quick run through a few effective well-being related workplace initiatives. And you guys will no doubt have many more examples and more ideas than we have. And then we'll briefly finish with just a little look at the benefits of a positive approach to mental health and well-being, both employers and for employees, and how that's a real positive in running businesses. Now, I'm going to pass over to Julie, who's going to take us through the first section of today's webinar around managing sickness absences when they relate to mental health.
Thanks, Gareth. Morning. Yeah, obviously, periods of absence related to mental health problems are at their core simply sickness absences, and should obviously therefore be treated accordingly. So that's our starting point. But it is obviously, as we've mentioned, important to recognise certain aspects of mental ill health absence require a more tailored response. And one of the first things that we thought would be useful to look at is how a manager should deal with an individual who's experiencing mental health issues at the very outset. So obviously, sometimes it's felt that managers are often less confident in dealing with mental ill health than, for instance, physical ill health. But the approach should be fairly similar. Again, it's getting past that stigma, I think, for both parties, and just being confident in using the current processes, but knowing how to adapt them. And obviously that allows you to focus in the best way on supporting the individual back to work, and also for you as the employer to get the best performance out of that employee. So it can seem difficult to know how best to approach and talk to an individual who may be experiencing mental ill health, but obviously early action can prevent the individual becoming more unwell, and it may lead to concerns being resolved before they escalate or worsen. So there's kind of two key scenarios. There's one where a manager will themselves approach an employee because they believe that they are experiencing mental ill health, and they take the lead and they arrange a meeting as soon as possible to talk to the individual in private. So obviously it goes without saying the conversation should be approached in a positive and supportive way. And then you have the other scenario where the individual approaches that manager, and the manager maybe feels slightly less in control at that point. So again, it's training them to be ready for that conversation and to kind of remember certain factors as that information comes to light initially. And it can be really simple things. Move the conversation to a private space so they won't be disturbed, obviously, if you're not already in private. Thank the individual for coming to talk to you. It can take a lot of kind of guts. Quite often an individual really is building themselves up, again, in a way that they wouldn't if they were coming in to tell you about a sore back. Allow that individual as much time as possible to speak and to get everything that they want to say out. Focus on what they say, listen, be open-minded. Try with them to identify what the cause is. And I think that's particularly relevant if they're coming to you to say, I'm stressed because of work. I have, maybe too much, or I'm not clear with what I'm doing with this project and it's really impacting me. Obviously, initially, you can be thinking about potential solutions. Be prepared for the unexpected. We've all had that conversation where you think it's going to go in one direction and something completely different is brought up. And don't be afraid to adjourn that meeting without really arriving at any resolution. In fact, that would always be my initial advice to employers and managers, is to take on board what's being said and then regroup so that you're giving the best solution. Obviously, there's a correct formal process to be followed when there is an absence with mental ill health. Such conversations can amount either to the employer identifying that this individual will need to take time off, or the employee is obviously coming forward and saying, I need to take time away from the workplace. And again, the starting point is the same processes that you would invoke if it was physical ill health. You want to communicate with the employee. You want to think about obtaining medical evidence. You want to hold formal meetings. Obviously, that would be more likely if there's a long period of absence, to discuss the best way forward. Oh. Sorry, I wondered if we had a question there. And with all stages recorded in writing, but certain adaptations to address the unique aspects associated with mental ill health. And a few frequent ones that come up in our experience that we would kind of advise you to look out for and be prepared to deal with. The big one is recovery timeframes can be much less certain than, say, someone dealing with a broken leg. And that can cause more anxiety for a person who's already struggling with their mental well-being and their mental health. And it's obviously difficult for the employer as well. So I think that one of the things to think about is having really good medical evidence, and that can be useful coupled with as much flexibility as possible about either a date of return or about how the person returns. And we're obviously going to discuss reasonable adjustments and such matters later, but it's just something to look out for, that timeframes can often not be quite as definite. Medical evidence is obviously your friend here, and I would say that it can be useful, as always teachers used to tell me, rubbish in, rubbish out. If you have a really good referral letter from the employer which really explains the employee's role and also any concerns about that employee's demeanour or behaviour that you have noted, then you're going to get much better medical advice at the other end. And it can also be a feature of mental ill health that the person themselves doesn't recognise some of the impact that it's having on their character. And often we all know how much time we spend at work and spend with colleagues, and so often it is colleagues that notice that someone is acting differently and is struggling. And so I wouldn't back away from incorporating that sort of information in any sort of referral. And the final key point that kind of comes up quite frequently is that obviously a return to work plan is something that you would usually create to assist the person to come back, but you might find that you might need to review it more regularly, as opposed to with someone again with a physical impairment, and that can allow subtle amendments as once the plan is put into practice. And quite a frequent one is that a phased return to work is planned with the employee gradually building up, and they might sometimes feel that that's just going a little bit too quickly, and you want to nip that in the bud, you want to address that. It's better to slow down a phased return rather than have the employee going backwards and potentially back on sick leave. So these are a few initial points at the outset of tackling an issue with an employee. And I think Gareth's going to have a look at the reasonable adjustment factor that we mentioned earlier.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah. So it's often the case, or there's always always a possibility that someone's mental health condition may amount to a disability. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we're not necessarily going to dwell too much on the definition of disability, because that would be an entire webinar in itself. But it's worth bearing in mind that there's always that possibility that someone's mental health condition may meet the definition of a disability under the Equality Act. Now, if it does, or if you believe that it does, then a certain obligation will kick in as an employer, which is the duty to make reasonable adjustments where you're able to do so. So the idea there is that the employer will make adjustments to the working environment that the employee works in, their working hours, their working patterns, their duties, that kind of thing. Make changes to that in order to negate the impact of the disadvantage that they suffer as a result of their disability. Now, that applies to all disabilities, whatever the cause of the disability, but obviously it can also apply whenever a mental health condition amounts to or may amount to a disability. Now, what we often say, particularly in relation to mental health conditions, is that even if the individual doesn't have a proven disability, or you're not quite sure, it still often makes the most sense for organisations to continue to make, or to go ahead and make the changes that would help their employees deal with or reduce or negate the impact of their mental health condition. It's just a sensible approach, whether you're legally obliged to do that or not, related to whether it's a disability. So always worth bearing in mind your ability to make reasonable adjustments to the employees' working arrangements or responsibilities, etc. Now, small, simple changes to those arrangements may often be all that's required. So allowing people to have a bit more time as a rest break, changing their working patterns, reducing their duties for phased periods, so temporary periods or long-term periods, and can often be all it takes. Now, usually any adjustment should only really be made following discussion and agreement between the business, the manager, and the individual on what might be helpful and what's possible for the business to do. And the individual themselves will often be the biggest driver in terms of knowing what they need and the impact that changes may have on them. That doesn't mean as an employer that you need to make every single adjustment requested. It's about what's reasonable in the circumstances. But if you have the aim of caring for your employees, but also having them back in at work and performing their role and contributing to the business, it's going to make sense to try and do as much as you can, as much as you reasonably can, to have them, to make these changes, to have them back in work. Now, often referrals to occupational health, Julie's touched on getting medical advice and medical information. Often referrals to occupational health can be really, really useful in identifying adjustments. They'll have a good idea of exactly the kind of tweak to an employee's working pattern or working arrangements or duties that will really make a big difference. And often an employee, if they do see an occupational health professional, may be more prepared to be open and honest with them about what may help them. And then that report can come back to you and you can consider implementing those changes, again, by discussion with the employee. Any adjustments that are made, they always need to be documented. You need to be very clear that, and for your own sake as employers, to show what you've done and show the support that you've offered, you want to be having a record or a paper trail, as you might say, that shows that you've had discussions, you've agreed what changes you're going to make, how long they're going to last for, and how that's going to be monitored and checked and tweaked further, either required or as conditions develop or change or improve over time. However, whilst doing that, and this is one of the tricky things as employer, we all know that as employers that there's always these tricky balancing acts to make, as well as having the duty to make those reasonable adjustments. Equally, and this is where the important thing comes in about dialogue with the employee, we need to avoid making assumptions about what the individual can do. We shouldn't make decisions based on what we perceive or assume that they can or can't do. You know, that might relate to things like training opportunities, promotion, the time off they're going to take. We shouldn't assume that every single situation will be the same, or every person with a certain recognizable condition or a diagnosed condition is going to react the same or going to need the same support and changes at work. So it's important to treat every scenario as on an individual basis, as tricky as that can be, because obviously you're trying to balance so many factors, but it is important to take that individual approach. One thing that many of our clients have found useful is for individuals to draw up what are known as advance statements. So these are things where an individual can give notice to the employer or a list of things where they say, look, I may not spot these things at the time, or I may not know these things at the time. Now that I'm able to have this clear discussion with you about it, here are a few example signs when I'm maybe feeling unwell, or I'm struggling, or I may just need a bit of extra support. I may need a particular way of being treated by my employer when those scenarios arise. And that can just help manage the uncertainty, things that may exacerbate a condition which may otherwise be able to be dealt with a few little bits of support and changes there. So examples you might give, we've had clients, for example, where employees request somewhere where they can go, maybe a quiet space, a room for them where things become overwhelming, times of stress or upset or overstimulation or whatever it might be. They can take themselves off, and it's understood that that's what they'll do. Nobody's asking where have they gone, what have they done. You know, it's understood that they've taken that step to go and take time out, and that might be all it needs to avoid taking the day off or taking the week off or being ill for a longer period of time. It helps the employee and it helps the employer. So there can be times when that kind of thing can be really, really useful, kind of advanced, agreed little steps that we'll take when certain things happen. Obviously, the duty to make reasonable adjustments can also really kick in when someone's returning from a long period of absence, or maybe lots of intermittent absences. You would then maybe be looking at reasonable adjustments that are going to reduce those periods of absence. So it's about avoiding longer periods again from happening, making sure the employee can be consistently in and not missing, you know, a couple of days every other week and things like that, for their sake and for the employer's sake as well. So that's where you may be looking at more, as Julie's mentioned before, certain things that you'd be thinking about for maybe more physical injuries and illnesses, we would also bring into play for a mental health conditions. So you're looking at things like potentially reducing hours, reschedule, changing start and finish times and things like that. And that can really help employee just manage that return to the business. And that can often be on a phased basis. So instead of jumping straight in and going back to their full duties and their full hours, their full days, we can do that over a phased time, a month, 6 weeks, and we build up over time, and that can help people to gradually work their way back in. And that can apply to, as I say, hours worked, days worked, start and finish times, certain responsibilities, certain amounts of workload, different types of work and that kind of thing. They can also be temporary kind of reassignments around the business, shadowing, periods of shadowing and things like that. It may not be sustainable for the absolute long term for an employer, but if they help an employee return to work, can be put in place for short phased periods of time to help that person come back. And again, ideally, that would always be done through discussion, through agreement with the employee. This is what we think might help. Do you agree? Anything else that you think might help? We'll explore whether we can do that. It's all a two-way dialogue. So yeah, that's the kind of thing you'd be looking at. And as I say, that absolutely kicks in when mental health condition amounts to a disability. but it's always going to be best practice to do that anyway, even if you're not sure on the disability status, because it's just a good way of managing those kind of issues. I'm now just going to pass back to Julie, who's going to look at ways in which you may want to support other members of staff around mental health in the workplace.
Thanks, Gareth. Yes, it is something that I am asked about by clients. You know, that they are obviously, there's a lot of focus on dealing with the ill employee, but it inevitably has an impact on the team. So we obviously wanted to touch on that and how you should respond to that. And they can find it distressing, and it can also impact on their role and their workload. So a manager obviously needs to be prepared to support the team more widely as well, if it's affected by an individual with a mental ill health absence, or a mental ill health and at work phased return. You know, all the different permutations. So sometimes it's useful for the manager to physically be around the team. I've had a client who the manager kind of moved the desk into the pod just so that he could kind of take the temperature of the team a little bit more, and it looked and was much more available, and that can help to just boost morale a little bit if there's been a lot of change and disruption in a team. Having catch-ups with each member of a team on how they're doing. I mean, I think that's a useful tool for so many different aspects of workplace management, and that helps you quite often catch problems really early on. Make it clear that you're available to talk at any time, and deal with any concerns or worries that the team members may have, and promote to them as well the use of additional support services that you may have, counselling services or things like that. Just make sure that everybody knows that they're all entitled, if you have those tools, to access that and how it may benefit them. Care obviously should be taken as much as possible, not to put extra responsibilities or have unrealistic expectations of colleagues in the team that can obviously cause them unnecessary pressure. And that's easier said than done, I appreciate, because sometimes it's inevitable that if you're down a team member, then that there's an issue there. But communication with the whole team really is vital, and it should be agreed with the employee to ensure that confidentiality is maintained, obviously. And then that leads you on to managing the...
Sorry to interrupt, Julie. I think we just had a hand up earlier. I just spotted that.
Oh, yeah.
Chris, did you have your hand up for a quick question?
Yeah, it was actually, if I said, and it's actually relating to what you just said now as well, Julia. So one of the things you've mentioned is occupational health support and support services. As a small business, we don't have a huge human resources department, so I'm afraid you're looking at him, and trying to source that occupational health support and support services to somebody going through mental health issues. Is that something that we should have ourselves, or is it something that we can advise them to go and find and then support them to it?
So you would be the person that would arrange it. The business would usually arrange it, and the business would usually pay for that, because it's ultimately in your interest to have that, because it can be used in lots of different ways. It can be used obviously in the most supportive manner. So it's about, we're not experts, you're not experts, let's send you to someone who can give us some guidance. It can, unfortunately, you do from time to time get scenarios where people can't return to work legitimately. They're just too ill to return to work. And you can also get scenarios, few and far between, thankfully, but you can get people who can play the system and things like that. So you can get all sorts of these things, and they can be used across all of those. But in terms of the practical arranging of it, is most of the time it's going to be in your interest to sort it out as the employer. So therefore, the onus is on you to set that up, pay for it, arrange it, all of that sort of stuff. You need the employee's consent often to do it. Often the contracts will say that the employee is obliged to cooperate with that process, but ultimately they do actually physically need to give that consent. Now, in terms of finding someone, there are so many businesses out there that offer those services. We have relationships with a few. We, depending on the type of scenario that you're looking at, we can recommend different people. We don't take any referral or anything like that from it, not at all. But it's for knowing that these people will help you and do a good job and answer the questions for you. Might not always give you the answers you want necessarily, but they'll give you the clear answer in terms. They're not going to sit on the fence. They're going to give you advice. This is what you can do. This is what would work. That kind of thing. Most businesses, unless you've got hundreds of employees, you may not have someone to hand all the time, because you may not be needing it more than a couple of times a year tops. So usually with our clients, they'll speak to us and say, what was the name of that person again? Can you put us in touch? And that kind of thing. So we can always help with stuff like that. And there's always lots of different companies out there. There's a lot around Manchester that offer those services. Getting a good one, once you've found a good one, is worth its weight in gold, because you just want someone who's going to give you a clear opinion, get off the fence and be very clear about it. If you ever do have any specific scenarios, anyone at all, then give us a shout. We're more than happy to make suggestions and put you in touch.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Gareth. And I think I'm going to touch on it later on as well, that not only is there benefit to OC Health being used at the outset of mental ill health, but if you have quite a good relationship with that person, again, they can help with adjusting and return to work plans and things like that. Obviously, though, it does all have a cost implication, but ultimately it sometimes can be a net benefit still in terms of cost, rather than long-term ill health and the disruption, again, that being a staff member down can cause. Absolutely.
The other thing as well, Julie, isn't it, is the individual's own GP, or depending on what treatment they're receiving, counsellors and things like that, who can absolutely give medical reports and answer questions if they're willing to do that. But often you've got to bear in mind that sometimes they might be reluctant to do it because they're very busy. They've got more patients to see. They don't want to be writing businesses reports to help. As much as they want to help their patients, that's an employment thing. That's nothing to do with us. We've cared for the employee. That's the end of that. But most of the time you will get them from doctors. It might just take a bit longer. But then often they're going to be wary about what's the employer trying to find out, what they're going to use the information for. They might be cynical that the employer is trying to find a way of terminating the employee's employment on ill health grounds and things. So they can be both very valuable tools, but it's just about picking what is going to be the right one, what's going to really help. Occupational health will be very useful for general issues, so general mental ill health, for example. It may be less good at very specific stuff like, recognized clinical conditions or very serious conditions. I mean, I don't want to stray into areas I'm not an expert on. If you were talking about particular conditions that require very specialist advice, then you're going to want to be speaking to consultants and doctors and just managing that process as best you can.
Yeah, thank you. So the other thing that I just wanted to touch in this section is how to actually handle the period of absence itself. So we've talked a lot about the employee either going off sick and dealing with the workplace, and also touching on, we're going to touch on getting that employee back to work. But there are certain tips really for dealing with the period of absence. So obviously staff will sometimes need to be absent because they are unwell, or because, although they're recovering, their medication might require them to not be at work. For instance, perhaps they can't operate machinery safely, things like that for a certain period. So there are a few tips, as we say, to manage this period of time and support the member of staff whilst they're off. The big one for me, I think, is agreeing with the member of staff when and how regular contact will be maintained during the absence. We've all experienced the employee who complains about too much contact and how that's contributing to their illness. And on the flip side, the same amount of contact can cause another employee to feel that they're being ignored and that they're being pushed out, they're managed out, and they feel very isolated, and it again exacerbates the situation. It's really important to discuss at the outset. I've had clients who have said, that the employee said, please stop phoning me at 1 o'clock on a Friday, you just ruin my weekend. Whereas another employee would like that because it makes them feel calmer, because they know that the working week is over, they've heard everything that has happened in that week. I mean, I'm not suggesting weekly contact, but just agreeing a pattern that works for that employee, and as we always say, building in a degree of flexibility. And then that they can't come back afterwards and say that that's a feature of an employment claim, that because they've agreed it with you. When you do have those conversations, be it in writing or if it is by phone or whatever, the manager should be trained to be positive, be professional, and be supportive. I know that sounds almost stating the obvious, but we have had situations where managers feel a temptation to empathise with the employee by agreeing with, oh, I felt like that, yeah, I feel like I've got too much work, or I'm having these similar issues in my personal life. And in fact, that's obviously not the way we want to go. Not oversharing. You want empathy, but it should be professional within professional bounds. And it's about that employee. It's not a kind of a cozy chat. It's about supporting the employee who is ill. Obviously, you want to agree with the team member about the amount of information and what information is given to their colleagues. Quite often you'll have colleagues who are friendly outside of work, and so some employees will know more than others, and that can be awkward for the manager dealing with the wider team. So it should be agreed up front. How do you want us to describe your absence? What sort of information do you want us to give? Do you want to be contacted by colleagues? Things like that. Obviously, it goes without saying not to pressure the team member to return to work before they feel ready, but obviously it should be something that's floated, and it's usually a benefit to say, we do want you back, and we're all thinking about how best to manage that, but without pressuring the employee. And you can discuss even during an absence about possibilities of phased return to work, and introducing OC Health. Even if you're not using OC Health, you can also use, really the GP, the employee's GP, and you can pay for reports with their consent and get information that way. And that sometimes is easier because the employee already has a relationship with their GP and is using that service anyway. But ultimately, maintaining regular contact is vital. Lack of contact obviously can lead to misunderstandings, make the team member feel that they're not missed, and make it harder for them to return. So it's appropriate to arrange to meet up in a neutral venue if you're wanting to have a catch up, or now we're all much more into remote and obviously telephone, things like that. An absent team member can, and we have had clients where this has been the case, request that they are not contacted at all. And I would say that you can agree to this to a certain extent. I mean, the guidance from ACAS is that you shouldn't really accept it at face value. But what you can do is say, well, look, let's agree that for the next 3 weeks, you're going to have a bit of time away from work, or whatever that time frame is. But obviously you're still wanting to be able to manage that person, and they are still your employee, and ultimately you are able to contact them because it's your right to be able to help and assist with them coming back to work. And as I mentioned earlier, having a kind of ongoing relationship with occupational health or the GP, even as the process unfolds, and when they're coming close to feeling that they have recovered and they're coming back to work, that can still be useful in the background to support and provide evidence for certain decisions that you're making as an employer, which leads neatly on to helping that individual return to work, which Gareth is going to cover.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah. So we've talked obviously a lot about managing the absence and about the meetings and discussions you'd be having. So we now just wanted to kind of move on to what happens when that person is returning. So you've agreed the plan, you've agreed what's going to happen. How does that play out in practice, or the steps leading to that, to making that a reality? But as we've said throughout, when a team member is ready to return to work, it's going to be really important to ensure that they feel supported and they understand what will be expected of them on their return. The employee wants, you as the employer want that return to be successful. You don't want them returning to another period of absence for everyone's sake. So really important that that is given the best chance of success. So supporting the employee in returning to work and recognizing that it might be them returning to work is just one stage on that ongoing process journey, whatever you want to call it. Now, in the run up to that return, it can always be useful to have sort of a pre-return meeting or a initial discussion in advance, just to be very clear and about what's been agreed on the return, alleviate any concerns they may have. And often it can be useful for that to happen away from the workplace, just depending on the nature of the condition the employee has, the symptoms and that they've complained of, or the things that may have triggered their ill health. It can be useful sometimes to just have that take place away from the workplace, certainly when there's been a longer period of absence. When they physically return to work, we also would recommend always a return to work interview. Now, you would probably do that for every single kind of absence that you have. Anything more than a very quick, absence, you would want to be looking at a proper return to work, even if that's just checking that everything's okay, there's nothing else to worry about, and returning it's fine. The similar sort of approach for this type of absence is going to be absolutely crucial. We would recommend that return to work interview. And again, lots of these recommendations are flexible, they're not set in stone. So I've said a pre-return meeting, a return meeting. I'm suggesting a lot of meetings here. In certain circumstances, that might not be quite what's needed. You might be able to be a bit more flexible about it. But you'll only know that from having understood enough about the employee's condition. And in other scenarios, absolutely, you'd want to be having these multiple meetings just to help build them back to returning to work, again, depending on how long they've been off, the nature of their condition, etc. The return to work meeting is always going to be a great opportunity to welcome the employee back to work. Just double check that they are well enough to return. You may have had lots of discussions, but it might be the first time you've met them in person, for example, since they've been off. So is what they're saying, does that match the reality of what you're seeing as well? And are they well enough to return to work, and are they comfortable with it? Are they as comfortable as they thought they would be? And everyone thought things can obviously change. Gives you a chance to update them on any workplace news, any changes that have been introduced, just so they don't feel might be overwhelming enough to return to the exact same environment. But if that's changed as well, again, depending on the condition, that may be something that exacerbates their scenario again, overwhelms them again if things are different from what they remember. Gives you also a chance to discuss their absence and any worries that they may have about returning to work, anything that they think may trigger further periods of in illness that you may not have covered elsewhere or you've not already dealt with. Confirm the working arrangements and what plans and adjustments you've put in place to support them, and also allow them to ask any questions and clarify anything. You may have done aspects of that during welfare meetings while they've been absent, during that pre-return meeting. But again, that return to work, that very first day, is a good opportunity to just get it all clear in terms of the return and how that's going to look. Now, HSE suggests that it can be very helpful to have a written plan for the return and their reintegration into the workplace. Again, that will depend on the circumstances. It's not necessarily an obligation to do that, but it can be very helpful and useful to be very clear about what's been agreed between you and the individual in terms of what you're going to do and what you're not going to do, just so there's no misunderstandings and everyone's clear. And you can also make it clear in there how that's going to be monitored, how their ongoing health and how their ongoing situation is going to be monitored, and when you might get to what could be called sort of a business as usual scenario, when being back, settled in, okay, they might there might be scenarios when they become ill again, but actually that we can step back from some of that support and management on a daily basis that we've needed to put in place because it's worked and we've eased them back in. So we can just agree in that sort of plan how that's going to work and how we can then reintegrate them into the usual processes and get back to that business as usual. So those little practical steps, that we can take when they return are all going to help minimize future periods of absence, future triggers of illness and things like that for the individual. I'm just going to pass back to Julie now, who's going to take us through the impact of these sort of mental health conditions on other workplace issues that you might be dealing with.
Thanks, Gareth. So obviously we've touched a lot on absence and managing absence, but sometimes you'll have individuals who are at work, but they are dealing with a mental health condition, and that then can impact on other kind of normal workplace issues like disciplinaries and grievances. And I think, as we've touched on before, the role of the manager is quite crucial initially in identifying, first of all, the workplace issue and also perhaps an interrelationship with mental ill health. And the fact that managers obviously play a crucial role in managing the well-being of staff. And so there's guidance again about training your managers to ensure that they're alive to these issues, and a few tips is that they are approachable, available, and encourage staff to talk to them if they are having problems. Just raising the idea of mental ill health in team meetings, things like that, just to make it much more ordinary and run-of-the-mill, to destigmatize it, can help to have those workplace conversations, tailoring as much as we can the management style to suit the needs of different members of staff, which you would probably do anyway, even if there wasn't health problems in the team. But that can be a really effective tool for managing the well-being of some people. Some people thrive under pressure, some people not so much. So just knowing your team and reacting to that. Obviously, things like monitoring staff workloads, setting realistic targets, and being clear about priorities, that can really cut down on a lot of anxiety within team members, even if it's not a full-blown mental ill health issue that would require them to take time off. You don't want your team feeling anxious and worried and issues with their well-being. And I think, as we've already touched on, regular one-to-ones, catch-ups, also to let the employee themselves know that there are areas of concern in a calm and more informal environment, and that can help to allow these challenges or problems to be overcome initially without a situation escalating. Sorry, but what you also want is that your managers are trained, they're confident in the knowledge to deal with mental health issues should they arise, be able to recognise common symptoms and signs of mental ill health, and we will look at some of these below, know how and when to intervene, have good policy documents and guidance as so that everyone knows where they are if they do have to tackle such a problem, know about any additional support that your organisation offers, and ultimately ensure that these responsibilities are reflected in the manager's job description and that they have the adequate training so they themselves don't feel overwhelmed or anxious in dealing with that. I would also say that it's important ultimately to send the message to managers, particularly not to shy away from workplace problems like misconduct or performance issues, because there is potential or actual mental ill health. The starting place should always be with your usual processes for managing performance or whatever it is, but build in flexibility, be prepared to do that. For instance, maybe allow someone to submit written submissions rather than have a face-to-face formal meeting, or allow slightly longer gaps between meetings so that the employee has time to prepare. And another one that was quite common that we advise is if the employee requests that they're accompanied in a formal meeting by a friend or a family member, to give really quite serious consideration to allowing that, even though you're not obligated to do it by law. That can really allow a process to kind of move forward, and it usually isn't too problematic, because that family member still has to adhere to the same rules. They can't answer in the person's behalf, they can't interfere, they're really there as support. So you can also find that, you know, a health issue is exacerbating a problem, for instance, a performance issue. And so you can agree to revisit the issue when the employee's feeling better, a bit more on top of things. And I would always say that if you are going to be sensitive and flexible in that way, then you record that you're taking that approach in the moment, and that you are you're giving them another chance, and that you're parking the issue, but that the issue has been identified, and that, I mean, that in itself is almost a reasonable adjustment. And that can be useful for to either ensure that the problem is resolved, or that the employee doesn't immediately go off work and neither issue is resolved, and again you're a team member down. There are a few other detailed tips about specifically managing disciplinary and grievance processes that I'm going to come on to, but as I mentioned, it is useful to train managers to how to recognise potential in mental ill health in employees, and Gareth is going to cover some of those points.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, we talked a lot about, or most scenarios you imagine might come about when an employee has a period of absence, and therefore they tell you the reason is, for example, a mental health condition, or they disclose that to the employer. But actually, quite often it'll be a case of the employee not necessarily missing time or disclosing anything, but actually changes a manager spotting certain things that may give rise to concerns that the employee may actually be unwell, and they may not necessarily realize it themselves, or they may not want to disclose it, etc. So clearly, all the things that we've talked about today, the sooner that an employer becomes aware that an individual is experiencing mental ill health, the sooner it can take some of the steps we've talked about and prevent it becoming more serious, perhaps prevent a period of absence, perhaps get some support in early before the employee becomes too unwell. And so it can be very useful for managers, particularly, to be able to spot these things. And we just thought we'd share a few examples of signs. Some of these may be fairly obvious, or things that you're already aware of yourself from your own the work that you do yourselves, but we just think it'd be useful to kind of share a few. So some of the things that our clients will share to us about concerns that they've spotted in their employees may be things like changes in their usual behavior, their moods, or how they've interacted with others. So someone's previously been top performer, consistent performer, all of a sudden they've had a period of underperformance, which is completely out of character, that's different from just the usual ups and downs that people may have. So the standard of their work or their focus is just out of the blue, just become different from what it usually is. You might see people appearing more tired or anxious or withdrawn, that they're not as interested in being involved in certain tasks or projects or with their colleagues as they usually would be. Some of their behaviour changed, perhaps there's an increase in smoking or drinking alcohol or appetite and things like that. An increase in sickness absence or being late for work, and that those may not go down as mental health illness reasons. So quite often employees will give different reasons for their absences. Oh, I had a cold this week, and then I had a tummy bug that week, and then I had a migraine that week. And those kind of things, when combined with some of the other factors, may just make an employer want to explore a little deeper, whilst not jumping to any conclusions or assumptions, whilst not overstepping the mark, which is obviously the difficult balancing act to perform. But these are the kind of things that you might want to be bearing in mind as a manager or an employer. Clearly, not everyone who experiences mental health will exhibit those obvious signs, or any or all of them. So it's important to regularly be asking individuals how they're doing and creating an environment where staff are able to be open and honest about how they're feeling. And And that's just a general well-being point in terms of, you know, meetings and how's everyone doing and checking in and things like that. It may not necessarily be in response to concerns about mental health, but it's more about positive well-being and things like that in the workplace, which again would be a separate webinar in itself to go through all those kind of issues. HSE recommends using certain routine management tools like scheduling meetings and appraisals and informal chats, weekly or monthly one-to-ones, not necessarily entirely focused on the job, the main tasks of the job. They also include how are you doing, how are you finding things, that kind of support, which I'm sure, you know, as many of the employers on this call are all very good at doing that, but there are really important things to do to maintain morale and also just support when anything's just potentially needs a bit more involvement from the employer. Just moving on to a concept that we see a few employers use, a few of our clients use, is things that are known as, people have got different names for them, but they're effectively wellness action plans. So this is something that the charity Mind will recommend. So I think you can even possibly download example forms and kind of guidance notes through that charity website. And they're sort of easy, practical ways for employees to support their own mental health at work and for managers to help to support the mental health of the team. But they can include kind of agreeing certain, as we mentioned before, certain triggers and symptoms and early warning signs of how mental health conditions may come about, or, you know, how you can spot and when support may be needed. And you can set out some details there of how you as an organisation or as individual managers will support. So they may be drawn up for the business as a whole. You know, this is our approach to wellness and mental health and things like that. Or they may be useful on an individual, obviously confidential basis, for dealing with individual scenarios, as we mentioned earlier. Julie touched on earlier about individuals who may not want to be in touch, or they may not want to be contacted, or they may feel unable to talk. And in those scenarios, it'll be important to have a sort of culture within the workplace that there are avenues, there are opportunities for those people to talk when they're ready, not to push them and pressure them into talking, to raising issues if they're not ready, but also to make sure that the opportunities are there when they need to have them. And again, further support, further advice may be sought externally if that's the type of thing that the employee or the employer recognise may be useful in that scenario. But it's encouraging these avenues of conversation, even if the employee may not be ready or able to immediately talk about their situation. And Julie touched on earlier about how you might manage certain conduct or capability scenarios when mental health is also a relevant factor. So I'm just going to pass back to Julie now to take us through a few points there.
Thanks, Gareth. So sometimes there's going to be no two ways about it. You're going to have to take formal action to deal with an individual's performance or conduct. Obviously, before formal, as with all employees, whether they're ill or not ill, there are a few things that you can think about doing before that formal process is invoked. And so, with an individual who is suffering from mental health issues, there are a few pointers that you can consider. For instance, additional adjustments or further support, which can help with performance or conduct, lighter duties for a period, or even a transfer to a different role. Sometimes an employee will accept that they're not going to manage the particular role that they're in, and a different role can make all the difference to how they feel and their performance and usefulness value to the organisation. Obviously, if further action is necessary, the manager ultimately starts with the organisation's usual procedures for handling whatever matter is relevant, for instance, be it conduct or performance. And a fair process obviously has to be followed. And in that process, the employer should note that they have considered the fact that work-related stress or mental health can manifest itself as misconduct or poor performance. And if there's a suggestion that is the case, that there's an underlying medical condition, or medication for an underlying medical condition, then that should be taken into account in any decision, any sanction, or any decision as to how to move forward. So it's just the fact that it has been recognised and considered is very useful in any formal process. Even if ultimately the decision is, notwithstanding the mental ill health, we are still going to take this action, or there's nowhere else to go with it, and this issue now needs dealt with. Obviously, these processes need to be handled confidentially and sensitively, and as we've touched on, if the individual has a disability, then reasonable adjustments should be factored into the disciplinary process, the performance review process, similar to the ones I mentioned earlier, perhaps giving an individual longer periods of time to consider their responses, advance notice of the questions that they might be asked in the formal hearing, even if they are going to attend. So there's lots of ways working with the employee that you can ameliorate any concerns or issues that their ill health may introduce to the process. If dismissal is a possible outcome, make sure that you have recorded the fact that alternatives have been considered. I mean, I think, again, that's standard with any employee, but it's probably even more important to show that you've taken account of all the factors that are playing into the performance or the misconduct before making your decision. There's non-statutory ACAS guidance, which can assist you with discipline and grievances at work, which can also cover the situation where there's ill health, stress, alcohol, drug abuse, and some of the noted guidance is that consideration should be given to introducing measures to help employees regardless of status or seniority, and that can actually be quite useful top down, walking the walk, talking the talk, that it's clear that very senior management has taken time out because they had mental ill health problems and that was impacting their performance. So the employee and the organisation are working together to help that person get better and help them come back to work eventually. And also sometimes an employer should consider whether it's appropriate to treat the issue as medical instead of going straight into a disciplinary process. And that really very much depends on the facts, the person, the issue at hand. And that's obviously something Gareth and I are on hand to give advice on. But again, what I think is useful to note is that it's the showing that you've considered it, even if you've carried on as usual, and having reasons and your rationale for doing so, that can always really help to enhance and support the employer's decision process if it's ever challenged further down the line. There are also increasingly effective wellbeing related workplace initiatives, and I think Gareth's going to cover them.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, and I'm conscious of the time. We've not got much more to get through. We've got a few more points we just want to share, and then we will have time for questions, but I appreciate we're only in for an hour, so if anyone does need to drop off, then no problem at all. But yeah, I'm just going to run through a couple of effective wellbeing related workplace initiatives that we've come across. Now, many of these are things you'll be familiar with. You might have many of these yourself. They're just a few in no particular order, no particular, just things for us to think about, really. And the important thing to say, really, with these kind of things is initiatives and well-being activities and things like that are never going to solve, or they're never going to be effective unless they're part of a wider culture of supporting mental health and well-being in the workplace. Otherwise, they can come across potentially a bit gimmicky or potentially a bit cynical. People won't buy into them. But if they're part of a wider culture that supports employees' well-being, puts that at the forefront of what a business does, then they can be useful little additions that can really support and actually minimize absences, minimize ill health, etc. So what we're seeing a lot of is you see a lot more what are referred to as either mental health champions or advocates or ambassadors in the workplace. That's something that's becoming increasingly popular. They're kind of points of contact within an organization that can be approached to offer initial advice to run initiatives to suggest things that may help health and well-being in the workplace, and really demonstrate that that's an important part of what you do in your business. A slightly more evolved part of that role is kind of having things like a mental health first aider, which is slightly more work similar to, say, a normal first aider, first point of contact for an illness or something that's happened, where they can point you in the right direction. But again, bearing in mind that we don't necessarily want to put too much responsibility on others necessarily. So you're just trying to work out what would fit best for your business, but that's a useful area that's developing. Other initiatives can include, promoting health and well-being in terms of providing healthy snacks, making lunch breaks mandatory, or better than making it mandatory, kind of leading from the top and having your senior managers demonstrating the importance of breaks, taking breaks, encouraging others to do that, rewarding staff for a job well done and praising them, and things like that doesn't always mean, bonuses and money and things like that, but the importance of recognizing how valued people are to the business can really go a long way in keeping their well-being and their positivity and health and that kind of thing in place. Reinforcing the importance of sick days and times off for people that do have health issues. So someone taking a couple of days off sick to help themselves recover from a period of mental health illness, it's going to be so much better for the business and for them than them burning themselves out and being off for months at a time and needing a lot more recovery time. So encouraging people to recognize when they're ill or they're struggling, to take the time that they need. And that might not necessarily be sick pay, but sick days, it may be things like using their holidays. I've come across many scenarios where an employee is taking a long time off for feeling burnt out, and all the holidays have built up. They've never taken any holidays. They don't feel they've been able to, and they're not getting the rest and opportunity that's available to them. Then you're looking at things like mental health resources, employee assistance plans, counselling services, potentially, if they're available. They're not necessarily the most as expensive as people might think to have these services available, and savings that they may bring to the business in terms of reducing time off and things like that can really help. And then just another couple of things around normalizing flexible working and allowing people to potentially change their working patterns, whether that's reducing hours or just changing the times in which they work. That may be all it takes to help people actually juggle their home life, their work life, and not need to take any time off. We saw a bit of an impact from the pandemic with people working from home and that becoming much more the norm, but it's actually helped people balance things and maybe don't need as much time off for ill health, because when they're struggling, it may be okay to just work from home. We won't necessarily encourage that if you're genuinely ill, but sometimes people, it might be the commute in, it's just that they're tired, they feel themselves just getting to a certain point. Actually working at home for a day might just help them get over that initial challenge and recover and things like that. So it's been a lot more flexible, and seeing how things can work has really helped. Clearly then, there are huge benefits to having a positive approach to mental health and well-being for both employers and employees. Making your employees healthier and happier at work is obviously a no-brainer. It helps to improve performance and productivity. Happy colleagues are going to be good performing colleagues. They're going to come into work. They're going to be excited about coming to work, or at least content to come into work and not feeling the need to stay off, or it'll reduce your absence levels. It'll reduce workplace disputes, things like that, with you and also between colleagues. It makes the organization more attractive to job seekers, particularly at a difficult time in recruitment. If you're a place that encourages positivity around mental health and well-being, and that you'll deal with any challenges that come up in a positive manner, in this day and age, that is becoming a really attractive proposition in a job, in a place to work, maybe even more so necessarily sometimes than the financial aspect to it. So that's really important. And clearly it's generally accepted that healthy, motivated people are going to go the extra mile. It's going to show in the customer service that they provide to your customers, if that's the type of business you're in. Fewer days off, more commitment, more creativity. It's just from our experience, it's just a positive all around. I'm just going to pass back to Julie. She's got a couple more points just to finish off, and then we'll have time for questions if anyone's got time for that.
Thanks, Gareth. Yeah, absolute whistle-stop tour of the potential legal claims, which are the same old, serious risks in the background of a lot of workplace disputes potentially. So mishandling, work-related stress, mental health issues can result with where the employee has more than 2 years service of a resignation, which triggers ultimately a constructive dismissal. And they would say that you as the employer, you've breached the implied term of trust and confidence. You have not looked after them. You have not approached them in a reasonable way when dealing with this with their mental ill health and whatever other issue it is that is at the focus of the workplace dispute. Obviously, the usual health and safety problems, negligence, breach of common law duty to take reasonable care. It can render a dismissal that you do take unfair if you haven't, as I say, factored in and turned your mind to the different kind of nuance that the mental ill health will give rise to. Obviously discrimination, particularly disability discrimination. So all of these big beasts effectively that lurk in the background and can result in significant compensation. And even if you are successful, it's expensive and stressful to deal with litigation of any sort. So ultimately it makes sense for employers to get ahead of this issue and allow managers to tackle and manage the impact of mental ill health on their business or organisation. And I'll just open the floor to any questions, although as Gareth said, I'm conscious that we've spun on a little bit, but if anyone's got any questions, feel free.
Thanks, Julie. Thanks for that. Yeah, we've kind of rattled through quite a bit there, and we want to try to give you as much as we can on this issue because it is so important at the moment. We could have easily done a webinar on, managing an absence from start to finish, on disability discrimination claims, on reasonable adjustments. So it is a whistle stop, but hopefully it's given you a bit of an insight. Had to go at some clips, so hopefully it was helpful. But yeah, any questions at all, happy to answer. Astrid, your hand's up. How are
Hello,
you?
I'm very good. How are you doing?
Yeah, good, thank you.
It's very timely. I've got quite a few people off or have been off recently with mental health issues. There's one in particular that I'm organising an occupational health therapist for this week. This person, there is an issue in that they're not taking accountability for their absences and the challenges it's having on the knock-on effect it's having on the team and also the clients. And so they're not meeting us halfway. Mm-hmm. So the manager is very much going more towards them, and this person is, oh, it's not my fault, I'm ill. It's very difficult to manage. So I am going to get the occupational health therapist in. I am going to have a very open conversation with them and treat them obviously with compassion and dignity and respect that they deserve. If they're not, they've got this massive blind spot though. Have you got any advice of how is there anything else I can do apart from managing it with compassion and empathy that you would recommend I do in this initial chat with this person this week?
Yeah, I suppose looking, I'll come back to the initial chat, but looking, I suppose, at the bigger picture, whilst a lot of what we've talked about today is about being compassionate and supportive, at the same time, obviously, we've got to balance that against the needs of the business as well, and it's supposed to be that balance. It's important to keep, and I say that because it's important to keep in mind that ultimately, if an employee is unable to form the job that they're doing, that they're supposed to be doing, either because they're on a long-term sickness that they're unable to come back for a sustainable period, or if they're intermittently having these absences, which mean that you're not getting that consistent attendance and performance, then ultimately, and there's a long process to follow to get to, but ultimately can be a fair ground to terminate someone's employment on the grounds of capability. Now, obviously, I know you know that, Astrid, you'll have dealt with many scenarios like that, but that can just help us to start introducing some of that to the process, that actually, look, our aim is to support you and resolve this and have you back in work and delivering. But ultimately, there comes a point when it's not actually sustainable, and it's not fair to anybody. It's not fair to the business or the employee or the other employees who are having to maybe work harder, pick up more, take on more responsibility, thinking, well, and then they may have their own challenges that come into it. It can then depend on the size of the business and the situation the business is in. It can put financial pressure on the business, and it can put other people's jobs at risk in redundancies and things like that. So I know that sounds a bit drastic, but it's about understanding that ultimately trying to achieve this. But if we can't, because you won't cooperate with us, because you won't give us the information we need, because we can't get it, then we may have to make certain decisions just based on what we're seeing. And that may include considering whether the position is sustainable. The ideal will be always getting them to an OC Health or medic who can tell us they will be fit if this happens, or they won't be fit at all. You've got some sort of clear route you can go down, because that can help you point to that and say to them, look, this is what's being said. But ultimately, it's back to what Julie was saying, where if they will not cooperate at all, they're either ignoring it or they won't consent to certain things in the process, then you get to the stage where you've just got to do the things you need to do to protect the business. While still showing that support, but also trying to move it on for everyone's sake. Yeah. Sorry, Julie, you
Yes, no, all I was going to say is that I think mental ill health, whilst absolutely real and genuine in most cases, and even where it is genuine, it's not a magic cloak. And I think some employees think it is, that say, well, I'm not well, so that's it. You have to do absolutely everything and anything to kind of keep me in position and just wait it out. So I think sometimes it's valuable to just know that ultimately the employer is in control, and whilst it's beneficial to flex a process and to give that employee a little bit more than, for instance, you may do with an employee with a physical ill health, it can still be made plain at the outset, as you would with physical ill health, that we're going to consider a range of options, and within that range there is always the possibility that you're not going to be able to continue either in your role or with the organisation. And that's where letters to the meeting are very useful, because that can be set out in writing, so that the employee knows that it's not all on their terms effectively, and that it is a two-way conversation that may ultimately end up with them not remaining in post. Because I think sometimes, as I say, it's thought of as a silver bullet by employees, that you're untouchable, and that is absolutely not the case.
And also they might think that by not cooperating, I know it might not necessarily be exactly your scenario, Astrid, but you see it a lot of the times where an employee falls into the misunderstanding that by not cooperating, by not giving certain information, that's the best thing that will help them, because actually you can't do anything then I'm not going to let you get a report from my doctor, because if you do, you might make a decision. So if I just refuse to cooperate, then things will just stay as they are. And that can be just part of the situation you're dealing with. They may not be genuinely trying to cause problems. That's just how they're thinking at that time. And usually the opposite is nearly always true, because by not helping us and getting the information, then okay, they might stall the scenario for a few weeks, longer than they might, but ultimately we're more likely then to have to take a more drastic decision, which we could have avoided had we been we're looking for ways we can support you, but if we can't think of any and you won't tell us any and you won't let us ask a doctor what they might be, then we're out of ideas. And so actually it can be not necessarily putting it in stark terms, but saying to them, look, cooperating with us and meeting us halfway, as you described it, is going to be the best out. It's going to help us get the best outcome for everyone. We want you to stay. We want you to support you in coming back in. And we need your help in doing that. Otherwise, our hands are going to be tied.
It can also be that instead of an uncooperative employee, you have an employee who kind of wallows in the illness, like, yes, I'm the most ill person of ill people. And again, I think they think that that protects them, and so it's making it clear from the outset that ultimately that there can be the worst case scenario is that maybe they can't continue in their role, and as I say, that it's there's ways and means of doing that, but yeah, sometimes it kind of they need to be shaken a little bit as to we all need to work together, or this can go in the wrong direction.
And I can actually say that up front, along with other options in supporting them.
Yes, well, absolutely, and that's, as I say, it's quite often. I mean, I'm not sure, obviously, at what stage the you know, how long this individual's been absent for, but yes, quite often when I do an invitation letter to a meeting to say we want to discuss your ill health, you've now been off for 3 months, we want to discuss, you know, when you might be able to return, what we can do to support you, but within that discussion we also may have to consider the fact that you can't continue in your role, and that can focus minds.
It's more at that stage about if you're dealing with the ill health side, before you ever took a decision to terminate employment, you would always need to have a formal capability meeting anyway. So you're not necessarily saying that's the decision I'm about to make, but you're just putting on the table the idea that we'll have to consider that. And it would then be considered at a meeting. We don't know which way it would go necessarily, and it would be a last resort to ever terminate someone's employment. But it just shows them that is ultimately
it's an option.
What may have to happen. It's picking the right words and the right time.
Yes.
If you're getting stuck into a stalemate, then that's when you start having to go down these different routes. And you never know then how the employee might react or what might happen. But the alternative is just letting the stalemate drift, I suppose, and then that's not helping anyone either. So you've got to start taking a few of these steps.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you very much.
And one last very quick final point is that's where medical evidence can really be your friend. So you can have quite a light touch, and once you get the medical evidence and it's much clearer, the kind of parameters of their ill health and potential reasonable adjustments, that's when it can become really clear that potentially not continuing in a role is an option. And as I say, if they don't cooperate with you, so that it's useful to be able to rely on that.
Right, thank you very much.
We've got a hand up from Josh.
Are you okay?
Hi, Josh. You're right.
Hi, Josh.
Yeah, not too bad, thank you. So yeah, it's a very similar situation as the previous point. The one thing I'd like to ask is we've got a like I say, very similar situation, but we really do want to help this person, but we've had no contact now for about 6 days. Now we sent a welfare letter. We requested to arrange a meeting. At what point, or is there any point that we can, because we've got a duty of care, when we really do want to support this person, that we could ring an emergency contact and see if we can get that way, because he is a young lad, he still lives at home with his parents. Is there any way that we can just make sure that he is actually okay?
So are you talking, I know we've talked about this one, haven't we, Josh? And I think there's some next steps to come, but I suppose if we're just in a general sense, if we're talking about, if you're talking about an emergency scenario where you're saying I need to check on if that person is okay right now, then I suppose that's a different scenario, and you would really try to treat that in as much the same way as you would any other illness. So you should have next of kin details and things like that you would potentially use. Obviously, you're going to want to make sure you use that in the right circumstance, but equally, if you genuinely did have concerns that something had happened, and I would talking in extreme terms, but if you were concerned about that kind of thing, then you're going to want to make the contact and kind of worry about the complaint afterwards that you shouldn't have rang my mum or you shouldn't have rang my partner. That's going to be the least of your concerns. I suppose if you're moving away from the emergency and it's just about they're just shutting themselves off and they're ignoring all of our contact, maybe less appropriate to use a next of kin, and it's about using all of your avenues of getting in touch with that person.
Yeah, the big concern for me is just so out of character, and that's where it's now coming to the point where we think we just don't know.
Okay.
I mean, I agree with Gareth. I think if there's a kind of a sense of emergency, you wouldn't be accused of overstepping, you know, by simply. But I mean, all you're going to do is say, "Is this person all right? They've not been, you know, they've not been in work, and we're worried about them." You're not going to start just, you know, discussing their contract of employment or their, you know, any other particular details. I would. I think if you're worried.
Yeah. Okay.
Other than that, in the kind of rest of the procedure, if it wasn't an emergency scenario, if it was clearly out of character, that they're not well, you know that. So we're managing it in some of the ways that we talked about there. So you do need to get some interaction from that person to understand, even if the answer is been signed off for a month and the doctor said, look, I need to not deal with anything at all work related, then we can adapt to that. We might not necessarily accept zero contact for a month, as Julie was saying, but we might say then, okay, we know you're unwell, and we will then move into some of those stages that we talked about how we look to get a return to work at some point, and that might be not appropriate to deal with that immediately because they need that month to recover. And then we'll arrange a conversation to start talking about those things. We start moving into some of those practical steps. But at the moment, if it's a case of how do I get any response from this person, and I don't want to be going down the route of anything more drastic, like considering terminating their employment, etc. At this stage, we don't need to, but we just need to try and find a way of getting in touch with them by all of our means. So you're talking about the calls,
WhatsApp.
text messages, WhatsApps, all that kind of stuff. That you know.
So Facebook Messenger, for a situation like this, Facebook Messenger would be fine, just because we haven't had any contact.
I don't see why not, really. Just to say, look, we've not had any contact, we're just trying to reach you, and it might be then that you use that Facebook Messenger to basically say, look, can we send you a letter by email just to get things open? Can we arrange a call?
Yeah.
And you can make that,
that
private, can't you? You can direct message on Facebook. So
yeah,
you'd always want to be keeping it as private as possible. That would be the only kind of caveat to that.
And you would also probably want to make sure then this is what's not so easy about using some of those other messenger services, is keeping a record of it. So you might want to be looking at screenshots and things like that to make sure that this is how we've tried to contact him.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. Thank you.
But I know you sent me an email, Josh. So we need to catch up on that anyway, don't we?
Yeah, if that's okay.
So we will do. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great.
Anything else? I know we've gone well over, but having some interesting chats there. So hopefully everyone's found that useful. Becky, is that your hand up?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, Becky. Yep.
Just a quick one. You know, you talked about at the beginning about when somebody returns and possibly making reasonable adjustments for a short period, and it should be documented and everything. Is that then different to what we would class as flexible working? Because it could only be for a short time, or how does that work?
Yeah, so in practice, it's ultimately has the same effect. But if you're talking about, you would know from the conversation, I suppose, with that person that whether it's a phased return, as in we're going to reduce your hours for a set period of time and build up, or whether we're doing that permanently. And I suppose so they are separate. So it wouldn't make it a permanent flexible working request unless the employee asked for it. And indeed, it's not, it wouldn't be inconsistent for the company to say, look, we can give you a phased return to help you return from an illness, and you're perfectly entitled to ask for that as a permanent flexible working request, but we can't accommodate it as a permanent change. Clearly, you'd have to have some justification for why that, it worked for a bit, why can't we do it permanently? But ultimately, they can be separate things. So we're phasing you back in by reducing your hours, but actually the idea behind that is getting you back to the full-time role, which is what we need you to be doing. So we'd be agreeing the phased timetable, and that can be whatever it needs to be. If that employee then says, look, this is what I need it to stay like, then they can ask you for that. And you may not insist on a flexible, put it in and we'll go through a very formal route. You might just be able to continue the conversation But you just kind of adapt to that at that point and see whether actually it did work. And if that person's then saying, well, look, this is the thing that I need now, it may then turn into a reasonable adjustment. So you may be then more obliged to turn it into a permanent change. But again, the reasonable part of the phrase reasonable adjustment means not every adjustment that the business has to make. It has to make those that are reasonable. So if someone comes back and says, oh, I know I was working 5 days a week, but I think it's a reasonable adjustment to allow me to now work 1 day a week, the business might consider that and say, well, on a flexible working request, we can't allow it for these reasons. But as a reasonable adjustment, it is an adjustment, but it's not a reasonable adjustment. It's not something that the business could reasonably accommodate. But on the other hand, if an employee said, I get triggered with my kind of anxiety if I'm stuck in rush hour, and actually if I could shift my start time from 9:30 and finish at 5:30 instead of 9 to 5, and that doesn't really bother the business very much, then that could become an easy, reasonable adjustment to make, because it's just reasonable to allow that within the confines of the business. So there's no black and white. This is reasonable, this isn't. It'll all be about the business and what it needs. But yeah, you can see how these things can interact. It's a phased return, then it's a flexible working request. Oh, but is it actually a reasonable, permanent, reasonable adjustment? And just considering all these things. And usually the conversation and your knowledge of the situation will kind of guide you through knowing what you're doing. As long as you're alert to these things that you need to be aware of, then it will guide you through. And then we're always available if you're thinking, oh, I'm not quite sure actually whether I need to go down this route or that route. Do I need to have a formal flexibility, flexible working here and now? Because they've said this, and we can discuss it. So yeah, lots to think about. No worries. I think this is the longest one we've done, so thanks everyone.
A marathon.
Yeah. Hopefully it was useful, and obviously people have had to drop off, which is fair enough. Yeah, unless there's any further questions, we'll bring that to a close.
Thanks everyone.
Well, thank you. Really helpful. That's very
Bye.
helpful. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks. Bye. Bye. Astrid. Bye.
There we go.
Good.
Just gonna